The search and rescue team called it a tragic accident. An experienced hiker vanished. They found her pack, her tent, everything but her. They don't know about the final file on her phone, a video of pure blackness and a sound that physics can't explain. I know what it is. It's the sound of the rules my family has followed for generations, the rules she must have broken. My family has lived on this land for over 200 years. 300 acres of dense, unforgiving forest that bleeds right into the Appalachian Trail. Growing up, the trail wasn't a landmark. It was my backyard. I learned to track deer here before I learned to drive a car. I know the smell of the air before a summer storm, the taste of the water from High Creek, the feel of the moss that grows only on the northern faces of the oldest stones. I love this forest, but I'm beginning to understand that the forest does not love me back. It doesn't love anything. It simply endures, and it watches. My grandfather Arthur is the one who passed down the traditions. He's a man made of hickory and stubbornness, his skin a roadmap of his 80 years spent under this same sun. To him, the forest isn't just wood and rock. It's a kingdom with laws far older than any of ours. He calls them the rules of the house, not God's house, just the house. Just this morning, I was in the kitchen with him. I told him I was heading out to check the boundary fences near Miller's Gap, since some of the weekend hikers had been cutting through our property again. He stopped cleaning his old rifle and fixed his eyes on me. That look, it's a look that's always unsettled me. It's not anger, it's not concern, it's a deep ancient fear. He said, "New moons in 2 nights. You know what that means. Stay on our land. Don't go wandering onto the public trail after dusk. And if you're leaving salt licks for the deer, add a little iron filing to the ones on the eastern boundary." I tried to reason with him like I always do. "Grandpa," I said, "we've been over this. The deer don't care if there's iron in their salt, and the phase of the moon doesn't make the trail any more dangerous than a twisted ankle already does. These are just old stories." His voice dropped then. It lost its usual cantankerous edge and became something else, something grave and chillingly serious. "They're not stories, Liam. They're instructions. For 2 centuries, our family has kept the peace because we follow the instructions. You think we're just superstitious old fools? You think your great-great-grandfather just made this up for fun? He saw what happens when the rules are broken. I've seen it. Don't you be the one who has to learn it the hard way. The rules were always the same. Insane, specific, and delivered with the certainty of religious scripture. Rule 1, never leave offerings of anything but salt and iron. Rule 2, never stray from the marked path on a new moon. Rule 3, the one he repeated most often, never, ever answer a voice that calls your name if you cannot see its source. He'd say that the forest learns names, that it likes to practice them. I always dismissed it as folklore, a way to keep kids from getting lost in the woods. A ghost story to tell around the fire. Then a hiker named Sarah Vaughan went missing. Sarah wasn't a novice. She was one of those hardcore thru hikers, documenting her entire journey online. Thousands of followers watched her every step. She was experienced, well-equipped, and she knew the risks. I'd seen her pass by the edge of our property a few days earlier, and we'd even exchanged a wave. She'd posted a video from her tent the night she disappeared, less than 5 miles from our land. She was talking about a strange, low humming sound she couldn't identify. She laughed it off, guessing it was a distant power line or mining equipment. That was her last post. Because I know this terrain better than anyone, I helped with the search and rescue efforts, unofficially. The SAR team leader, a good man named Peters, showed me their command post map. He pointed to a circle. Her last GPS ping came from her satellite messenger at 2:17 a.m. right here. We've had teams sweeping this grid since dawn. Ground, canine, drone flyovers. We've found nothing, not a footprint, not a broken branch, not a wrapper from a protein bar. She just evaporated. I told him that the terrain there is rough, but not impossible. If she fell, if she was injured, there would be some kind of sign. "You'd think so," he said, rubbing his tired eyes. "The weird thing is the data from the device itself. We had the company run a diagnostic on the signal. It wasn't a clean ping. We actually got 2 distinct data packets, milliseconds apart. He showed me the raw data on a tablet. It was mostly gibberish to me. The first set of coordinates is the one on the map," he explained. Standard elevation, right in the middle of the search grid. The second one, the tech guys are calling it a ghost signal, a data reflection, probably just a satellite glitch. I asked him what the coordinates were. He just scoffed. See for yourself. They put her 500 feet in the air, directly above the center of the grid. Or if you account for the topography, the other interpretation is that the signal came from a quarter-mile inside Black Iron Ridge. That's 500 tons of solid granite. Like I said, a glitch, machine screw-up. A glitch, that's what he said. But a cold dread, heavy and sickening, settled in my stomach. I heard my grandfather's voice in my head, a memory from my childhood when my first digital watch went haywire on a camping trip. Don't trust your machines out here, boy. The trail gets lonely. Sometimes it lies to them, just to have something to talk to. I had laughed then, I wasn't laughing now. After 4 days, they scaled back the official search. The weather was turning, and without any new leads, they moved to limited, continuous operations, which is a polite way of saying they were giving up. The official theory was that Sarah, an expert hiker, had somehow gotten completely lost, fallen into a hidden crevice, or been dragged off by a bear that left no trace, all while her emergency beacon malfunctioned in a uniquely impossible way. Everyone accepted it. But I couldn't. It felt wrong, too clean, too quiet. That night I argued with my grandfather. I told him I was going out myself, that I was going to search the places the SAR teams couldn't. I was going to check Black Iron Ridge. His face went pale, and his voice was a strained whisper when he spoke. You will not. That ridge is not for us. The symbols on the trees, they are not suggestions, Liam. They are warnings. You stay away from there. Let the forest have what it has taken. You go looking for her, and it will know your name by morning. His fear was so real, so absolute, it almost stopped me. Almost. But the anger and the frustration were stronger. The thought of Sarah alone out there gnawed at me. The next morning, before the sun rose, I packed a bag. I took my rifle, a powerful flashlight, and a deep breath. I was going to break the rules. The area my grandfather had forbidden was less than a mile from the main trail, but it felt like another world. The silence was the first thing I noticed. Not quiet. Silence. A thick, pressing void where the chirps of birds and the buzz of insects should have been. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I followed a line of the marked trees, my heart pounding with a primal fear I hadn't felt since I was a child. The symbols carved into the bark were ancient, a series of spirals and sharp, angular lines I'd seen in my family's old journals, but never paid much mind to. And then I saw it. At the base of a colossal, gnarled oak tree, one marked with the most complex symbol of all, was Sarah's backpack. It wasn't torn or damaged. It was sitting upright, leaning against the tree as if she had just set it down to take a rest. It wasn't dropped. It wasn't discarded in a panic. It was placed. The deliberateness of it was more terrifying than any sign of a struggle. I approached it slowly, scanning the trees, the ground. Nothing. Just my own footprints in the damp earth. My hands shook as I unzipped the main compartment. Inside, everything was neatly packed. Her sleeping bag, her stove, a book. In the top pocket, I found her phone. The screen was cracked, but it had power. I turned it on. The wallpaper was a picture of her with a smiling golden retriever. I navigated to her photo gallery. It was full of her trip, selfies on scenic overlooks, pictures of wildflowers, videos of babbling brooks. I scrolled to the very last file. The thumbnail was just a black square. The file was created at 02:15 a.m., 2 minutes before her last GPS ping. The last file wasn't a photo. It was a video, 12 seconds long. I pressed play. The screen was filled with absolute black, not the black of a covered lens, which often has some light leak or pixel noise. This was a flat, dead, light-swallowing black. And then, the sound came through the phone's tiny speakers. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't any animal I've ever heard. It was a sound that didn't feel like it was entering through my ears, but through my bones. A low, resonant, subsonic hum. It vibrated in my teeth, a deep guttural thrumming that seemed to bend the air around it. It was a sound that felt ancient and intelligent, a sound of immense scale like a mountain clearing its throat. It was unnatural, impossible, and utterly terrifying. The video ended. The silence of the forest rushed back in, now feeling 1,000 times more menacing. I was breathing heavily, staring at the phone, then at the woods around me. The puzzle pieces snapped into place with horrifying clarity. The impossible GPS coordinates, the family rules, the placed backpack, the sound. The crushing weight of understanding settled on me. My grandfather was wrong. They weren't just stories, they were survival guides. And Sarah had broken a rule. She had heard something in the dark, something impossible, and she had done the one thing you're never supposed to do. She had listened. She had tried to understand. And the forest, the real forest my family has been hiding from, had noticed her. This wasn't an accident, this was a transaction. And I was standing at the site of the exchange. My grandfather always said that some things in the forest shouldn't be found. Now, I think one of those things found Sarah. But it didn't just take her. It left this phone. It left this recording, it left a clue, and I feel like it left it for me. If you want to help me find out what this sound is, and why my family has been terrified of these woods for centuries, subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. My investigation is just beginning, and I have a terrible feeling I'm already in way over my head. The journey back to the farmhouse was a mile-long descent into madness. Every familiar landmark of my childhood had been recontextualized into a monument of terror. The gurgling creek I'd fished in as a boy now sounded like a choked whisper. The ancient moss-covered stones where I'd sat and watched the sunset now seemed like rows of crooked teeth in a monstrous slumbering jaw. The forest itself felt different, as if my discovery had been a switch, turning off a pleasant illusion and revealing the terrifying machinery beneath. The air grew thick, heavy with an unspoken pressure, and the natural, chaotic symphony of the woods was replaced by a synchronized, watchful stillness. I felt a million unseen eyes on my back, and the phone in my pocket pulsed with a phantom energy, a cancerous artifact I had foolishly excavated from its tomb. I clutched the rifle in my hands, not for protection against bears or mountain lions, but as a useless talisman against a dread so profound it had no physical form. When the silhouette of the farmhouse finally cut through the tree line, it didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like the last lighted window on the edge of the void. My grandfather Arthur was at the kitchen table, a sentinel in the dim light, the half-empty glass of whiskey beside his hand, the only sign of the hours he'd spent waiting. He didn't look up as I entered, but I saw his shoulders tense. He had felt my approach, the same way an animal feels a change in the weather. He knew. When he finally lifted his gaze, his eyes bypassed the backpack I dropped on the floor and locked onto my face. In them, I saw not the weary frustration of an old man whose advice was ignored, but the hollowed-out look of a pallbearer seeing another coffin being lowered into the earth. "You went to the ridge," he stated, his voice a dry rasp of dead leaves. It wasn't an accusation, it was a diagnosis. "And you brought something back with you." I slid Sarah's phone across the worn surface of the oak table. It stopped inches from his hand, a black rectangular omen in the warm light of the kitchen. The ensuing silence was a physical presence, a crushing weight that seemed to suck the very air from the room. I recounted the entire experience in a choked, hurried whisper, the unnervingly neat placement of the backpack, the pristine condition of her gear, and the final 12-second video. I described the sound, the impossible bone-deep resonance that felt like it was trying to rearrange my molecules. I saw a tremor run through his hand as he reached for his glass. He didn't need to hear it. He had been hearing it in his nightmares his entire life. "It's pushing," he finally murmured, his eyes fixed on the dark screen of the phone, probing the perimeter. "It hasn't been this inquisitive in my lifetime." The dam of my fear and confusion finally broke. "What is it?" I yelled, my voice cracking, the sound unnaturally loud in the funereal quiet. "For God's sake, tell me what you've been hiding from me my whole life. These insane rules, the carvings, the offerings. I thought it was just backwoods folklore, but it's not. A woman is gone, Grandpa. She's gone, and you knew this could happen." He flinched, but not at my anger. He flinched at my ignorance. He slowly drained his glass, the sound of it clinking against the table the only reply for a long moment. Hiding it? He finally met my eyes, and the sheer, soul-deep exhaustion I saw there extinguished my rage and replaced it with a cold, sinking dread. Liam, we haven't been hiding it. We've been containing it. This family, we don't own this land. We are its wardens. We're the keepers of a cage that has no bars. The rules, the symbols, they aren't for our protection. They're for everyone else's. They are the fragile terms of a truce and accommodation reached with something that was ancient when these mountains were still being born. And what's out there, his voice dropped to a near inaudible whisper, it doesn't have a name. You can't name a cancer in the bedrock. It is a condition of this place, a fundamental wrongness in the earth. The symbols on the trees are not cautionary signs. They are locks. They are chains. And you, boy, you just went and put your hand on the latch. He gestured with a trembling hand towards the cellar door. In the sea chest, the one that belonged to Silas, your great-great-grandfather. The answers you want, the answers I'm too tired to give. They're in there. Go read them, and pray you understand them before it's too late. I descended into the cellar's damp, earthy darkness, leaving him to his ghosts. The old sea chest was there, tucked away in a corner, bound with rusting iron straps. Lifting the heavy lid felt like opening a sarcophagus. The air that escaped smelled of time itself, of brittle paper, decaying leather, and the faint metallic scent of dried ink and old fear. Inside, nestled in yellowed cloth, were the journals, dozens of them, a complete chronicle of my family's cursed vigil. I carried them upstairs, the weight of my own history heavy in my arms. For the next 24 hours I did not sleep. I did not eat. I read. I fell through time listening to the terrified voices of my own blood. The earliest volumes were the worst. Jedediah, writing in 1788 in a cramped, frantic script. October 12th. The resonance returned with the first frost, a sour wind preceding it that the animals feel first. The cattle refuse the eastern pasture, and the dogs howl at the ridge, though nothing is there. I have refreshed the iron seals and made the salt offering at the old oak. It quiets the whispers for a time, but I feel it watching from the soil. It is a hungry silence. God preserve us from the intelligence that sleeps beneath our feet. His son, Silas, wrote in 1852, and his entries were more methodical, more scientific in their horror. He was the one who codified the rules. May 4th. Another traveler lost, a prospector from Boston, full of talk and disbelief. He laughed at my warnings. They found his mule still tied to a tree. Of the man there was nothing. It is drawn to inquisitive minds, to those who seek to measure and define it. Its hunger is not for flesh, but for the spark of consciousness. I have concluded that silver and prayer are useless provocations. Cold iron, however, it recoils from. Pure salt seems to disrupt its influence, clouding its perception. I have begun carving the anchors, the seals of binding, into the oldest trees, hoping to create a barrier, a line it will not cross. It is a language of physics, a conversation with a god of geology. I fear I am only teaching it our own grammar. I found a detailed sketch of the symbol I'd seen on the oak tree, the anchor seal, and beside it, a chilling note. This marks a place where the barrier is thin, a focal point, a place of exchange. Do not approach, do not linger, do not listen. Sarah had set her backpack down at the very altar of this terrible church. Then there were the journals of my great-grandmother, Eleanor, from the 1930s. Her entries were a descent into psychological torment. November 2nd, 1933. The whispers are different this cycle. They are not in the wind, they are in my head. It has learned to steal dreams. Last night I dreamt of my mother's kitchen, the smell of her baking bread so real, I wept. But when I turned to her, her face was a smooth blank canvas and her voice was the hum of the earth. I awoke screaming. It is not just observing us anymore, it is reading us. It is sifting through our memories like a prospector panning for gold, and it is taking the brightest nuggets for itself. It was all there, a 200-year-old legacy of terror, meticulously documented. My family weren't wardens. They were sacrifices. A long line of them, living generation after generation on the lip of a cosmic anomaly, hoping their strange rituals would be enough to keep it from spilling over. With this new, terrifying context, I turned back to the phone. My rational mind, what was left of it, demanded proof that wasn't written in fading, fear-soaked ink. I connected the phone to my laptop and launched a professional audio forensics suite. I isolated the 12-second recording and ran a full spectral analysis, watching as the program translated the sound into a visual representation. The result that rendered on my screen was a thing of profound and terrifying beauty. It wasn't the chaotic, jagged waveform of natural sound. It was a structure of impossible complexity and perfect crystalline symmetry, a fractal pattern that spiraled inward, repeating with the cold precision of a mathematical equation. It looked less like a recording of a noise and more like a captured piece of alien architecture, a blueprint for a consciousness that operated on principles that defied biology. The frequency analysis was a deeper dive into the abyss. There was the audible hum, yes, but the software revealed a colossal energy spike in the infrasound spectrum, so far below the threshold of human hearing it was practically a physical vibration. The energy signature was immense, comparable to the seismic shockwave of a deep earthquake. For it to have been produced in the open air of a forest was a physical impossibility. Then, my blood ran cold. As I magnified the primary audible waveform, zooming in until it was a single oscillating line, I saw them. Embedded within the wave itself were microscopic recurring patterns. They were not artifacts or noise. They were structured, binary, and deliberate. It was a signal nested within a signal, a language written in the very fabric of sound. It was the confirmation of Silas's worst fears. The sound wasn't a byproduct of the presence. The sound was the presence. It was a fraction of its voice, a single word from a language that used the laws of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics as its vocabulary. The first direct assault came 2 nights after my discovery. I was in my room, the journals creating a protective circle around me on the floor, my laptop screen glowing with the impossible, beautiful geometry of that sound. The house was deathly quiet. And then, from the yard just beyond my window, a woman's voice whispered my name. Liam? I froze, every nerve ending screaming. It was Sarah Vaughan's voice. Not a recording, not a vague similarity. It was her. The precise pitch, the soft cadence I remembered from her online videos. My mind clawed for an explanation. The wind, a hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation. But it was too perfect. Liam, can you help me? I'm so lost out here. Rule number 3 thundered in my skull. Never answer a voice that calls your name if you cannot see its source. My breath hitched in my chest. I crept to the window, peering through a tiny gap in the blinds. The yard was bathed in pale moonlight, utterly empty. The ancient trees stood motionless. It's so cold, Liam, the voice breathed, now seeming to come from right beside the glass. I scrambled backwards, falling over a stack of journals, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. I didn't answer. I sat there, shaking in the dark, until the first hint of dawn painted the sky gray. It was using her voice as a key, trying to find the lock that was my compassion. The next night, it changed its tactics. It didn't call from outside. It was already in the house. I was poring over a hand-drawn map from 1910, trying to correlate the locations of the anchor seals with the modern trail, when I heard it. A sound from the hallway, just outside my closed door. It was the sound of a small child giggling, a pure, innocent, joyful sound. And it was the most horrifying thing I had ever experienced, because it was a sound I knew intimately. It was a perfect recording of my own laughter, from a home video my mother had taken of my 7th birthday party. A memory I hadn't thought of in 20 years. To make it worse, I could faintly smell the cloying sweetness of birthday cake, a phantom scent from a life that no longer felt like my own. It was a violation of the deepest, most sacred part of me. It wasn't just mimicking sounds anymore. It was pulling threads from the tapestry of my past, reweaving them into a shroud. It had learned Sarah's voice, and now it was deconstructing me, my life, my memories. The investigation was no longer about a missing hiker. It had become an autopsy of my own sanity. This vast, silent intelligence was studying me with the detached curiosity of a scientist dissecting a lab rat, and I knew with the kind of certainty that shatters a man's soul that the experiment had only just begun. The days that followed the auditory incursions were not marked by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the waxing and waning of my own sanity. Time became a fluid, unreliable medium. The house, my ancestral home, had ceased to be a sanctuary. It was now an acoustic chamber, a meticulously designed instrument for my own psychological torment, and the entity in the woods was its virtuoso. I began to comprehend the true chilling methodology behind its attacks. It wasn't simply mimicking sounds to frighten me, it was conducting a series of intricate experiments. It would present me with a perfect crystalline stimulus, stolen from the very fabric of my soul. My own childhood laughter, the spectral, pleading voice of Sarah Vaughan. And then it would go silent, observing. I could almost feel its vast, cold consciousness, listening to the frantic, discordant symphony of my reaction, the violent spike in my heart rate, the flood of cortisol and adrenaline, the chaotic cascade of 1,000 associated memories firing uncontrollably in my brain. It was a form of psychic echolocation, mapping the deepest contours of my psyche. It was tasting my fear, analyzing my emotional resonance with the detached, methodical curiosity of a master vintner. I was no longer a person. I had been reduced to a specimen, a complex resonant object, from which this silent composer was learning to orchestrate a masterpiece of pure, individualized terror. My only conceivable defense, the single shield I could raise against this relentless psychic erosion, was knowledge. If I could not fight it, perhaps I could at least learn the rhythm of its monstrous heart. And so I turned back to the journals, not as a passive reader, but as a desperate cryptographer praying to find a Rosetta Stone for this language of dread. My bedroom, a place of teenage dreams and quiet contemplation, metastasized into the chaotic operations center for a one-man war against a non-physical enemy. I ripped down posters and photographs, replacing them with immense topographical maps of the region, until every wall was a sprawling grid of contour lines and elevation markers. I began a frantic, obsessive process of transcription, transferring the most vital passages from the decaying journals onto hundreds of index cards. I developed a color-coded system born of sleepless paranoia. Crimson red for every documented disappearance or casualty, cobalt blue for sensory anomalies, strange lights, impossible sounds, distorted landscapes, and a stark, funereal black for instances of direct psychological contact, the psychic incursions. Soon the floor was no longer visible, buried beneath a sprawling, chronological mosaic of my family's 200-year vigil at the edge of the abyss. The world outside my curtained window, with its mundane concerns and rhythms, ceased to hold any meaning. My grandfather, a ghost in his own home, would leave trays of food at my closed door. I'd find them hours later, the food cold and untouched, my stomach a tight, useless knot of anxiety. The house was saturated with his silent, grieving presence, but the chasm that had opened between us felt as vast and as cold as the one between myself and the intelligence in the woods. He had chosen the path of ritual and avoidance, a faith-based system of appeasement. I had chosen the path of understanding, the very transgression Silas had warned against with such chilling clarity in an 1853 entry written in a shaky, disintegrating script. I feel its focus upon me now, a palpable weight on my thoughts. My attempts to chart its influence, to define its boundaries with my instruments of iron and glass, have not gone unnoticed. It is a thing of immense, patient, and terrifying intellect. By studying it, I have inadvertently taught it the shape of my own mind. I have made my logic legible to it. This is a fatal error, the hubris of the naturalist attempting to classify God. One must not endeavor to solve the riddle. One must only and always endeavor to survive the Sphinx. I read his warning, felt the cold truth of it in my bones, and chose to ignore it. There was no other path left to me. I started with his own methodical, tragically scientific volumes. Silas had tried to map what he called zones of acute influence, using an arsenal of 19th century technology. He wrote of using lodestones and primitive galvanometers, documenting severe localized magnetic deviations in the immediate vicinity of the anchor seals. He described acoustic dead zones, pockets of profound and unnatural silence in the forest that corresponded perfectly with the grove where I had discovered Sarah's backpack. His journals were a litany of failed experiments, each one documented with obsessive, heartbreaking detail. June 12, 1854. In an attempt to find a counter-frequency, I placed a series of tuned steel forks at the perimeter of the old oak's dead zone. My hypothesis was that a pure, sustained harmonic might disrupt its resonant field. I left them at dusk. By morning, the forks were not merely gone, but the very earth upon which they had stood was vitrified, transformed into a glassy, black, obsidian-like substance, still warm to the touch. The resonance that night was agitated, a dissonant, angry thrumming that I felt in the foundations of the house. I have learned a terrible lesson. It perceives intent, it understands technology, and it considers our attempts to comprehend it as an act of aggression. This was a critical revelation. The entity was not a passive, slumbering force of nature. It was reactive, it was intelligent. It investigated its investigators with lethal finality. I then plunged into the fractured, poetic, and deeply disturbing entries of my great-grandmother, Eleanor. Her journals were not scientific logs, but desperate, terrified confessions whispered onto the page. She was the one who chronicled the entity's terrifying evolution from a primarily physical presence to a psychic predator. March 2nd, 1934. The dreams are becoming indistinguishable from memory. It is no longer content to mimic the sounds of the present. It has begun to plunder the past. Last night I did not dream of my own history, but of Silas's. I stood in his worn leather boots in the silent grove, holding his strange magnetic instruments, and I felt his academic curiosity curdle into a raw, primal terror as he realized the compass needle was not spinning randomly, but was tracing the patterns of the seals. I felt the forest press in on him, felt its cold alien intelligence slide into the delicate clockwork of his logic, searching for a gear to break. When I awoke, my room was thick with the scent of his pipe tobacco, a scent I have only ever read about. It is learning our history by consuming it. It is absorbing our lineage. We are not just its wardens. We have become its living library, and our minds are its reading rooms. This passage stopped my heart. The entity wasn't just stealing memories for the purpose of mimicry. It was absorbing them, cataloging them, integrating them into its own vast consciousness. Was Sarah's entire life, her thoughts, her hopes, her love for a golden retriever, now just another book in that terrible, silent collection? Was it reading her now, learning about the outside world, about cities, technology, the internet, about the 7 billion other minds that existed beyond its wooded domain? The thought was a physical violation, making my skin crawl. The most crucial, paradigm-shattering breakthrough, however, came from the most unlikely of sources, the pragmatic, ledger-like journals of my great-grandfather, Thomas. He was a farmer, a simple man of seasons and cycles, of planting and harvesting. And he saw this cosmic horror through that same rustic, practical lens. He hadn't just recorded the family's strange experiences, he had obsessively, methodically cross-referenced them with the mundane world. He had spent years combing through town archives, scrolling through microfiche of old newspapers, collecting clippings about missing persons, and noting sheriff's reports of hikers who went missing for days, only to reappear miles away, dehydrated and disoriented, with no memory of the intervening time. He was searching for a pattern, a timetable for the terror. I found the page, tucked away in the back of his 1958 journal. It wasn't a narrative. It was a hand-drawn chart, stark and terrifying in its simplicity. On the horizontal axis were years, spanning from the 1880s to his present day. On the vertical axis were two starkly different variables: resonance intensity, meticulously graded based on the descriptions in the family logs, and external disappearances, culled from public records. The pattern was not subtle. It was a monstrous, undeniable heartbeat graphed on yellowed paper. Every 7 years, a major disappearance, or a cluster of them, occurred on the Appalachian Trail or in the surrounding national forest every 7 years, almost to the exact season. 1912, 1919, 1926, There was a brief hiatus during the Great Depression and the Second World War, a decade of relative quiet, as if the ambient misery and chaos of humanity had somehow sated it or distracted it. Then the cycle resumed with terrifying punctuality. 1944, 1951, 1958. It was a horrifying, predictable agricultural cycle. It was a harvest, a tithe paid in human lives. A new, frantic energy seized me. I took his work and brought it into the 21st century. I dived into the internet's abyss, scouring cold case databases, missing persons forums, and digitized newspaper archives. I extended his grim chart. John Abram, a geology student from Ohio, vanished in 1965. The Miller Trio, 3 college students on a celebratory trip, gone in 1972. A renowned botanist, Dr. Alistair Finch, disappeared in 1979. A freelance photographer from New York, famous for his landscapes, vanished in 1986. I remembered my own parents whispering about that one. As the trail grew more popular, the disappearances became more publicized, but the pattern held. 1993, 2000, 2007, 2014. The last was a trail runner, an ultra-marathoner. They found his specialized water bottle, but nothing more. And then, the final crushing realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, a surge of icy adrenaline that made me want to collapse. I added the current year to the timeline. It was the 7th year. The harvest had begun. Sarah Vaughan wasn't an anomaly. She was simply the first. As if it sensed my discovery, as if my act of understanding was a direct challenge, the entity's campaign against me escalated dramatically. It moved beyond auditory phenomena and began to manipulate the physical world in subtle, insidious ways designed to make me question my own senses. One morning, I went downstairs to find a perfect 6-foot circle of dead grey grass on the front lawn, the soil within it unnaturally cold to the touch, despite the blazing summer sun. A few days later, I found one of my childhood toys, a small, intricately detailed lead soldier I hadn't laid eyes on in 20 years, sitting perfectly upright on the porch railing, coated in a fine layer of morning dew. It was positioned to be facing the woods, a tiny, silent sentinel. There was no rational explanation for how it could have traveled from a sealed box in the attic to that spot. The sensory manipulations became more complex and deeply personal. I would be poring over the journals in my silent room and would suddenly be overwhelmed by the distinct chlorine and sunscreen scent of the community pool where I'd spent my happiest summer days as a teenager. The phantom smell would be so powerful, so real, I would almost feel the sun on my skin. Then it would vanish. It was drawing a detailed map of my own nostalgia and then systematically burning each location to the ground, tainting every safe memory with its unclean presence. Then came the temporal distortions. This was the most disorienting attack of all. I would sit down at my desk, glance at the clock, 7 p.m. I'd feel as though I'd only been working for a few minutes, utterly absorbed in piecing together the grim timeline. But when I'd look up again, a jarring sense of dislocation washing over me, the clock would read 4 a.m., the sky outside already beginning to soften with the approach of dawn. 9 hours had simply evaporated. I had no memory of their passing. It felt as though I was a film, and some unseen editor was snipping out frames, leaving me with a disjointed, terrifying narrative. My intimate knowledge of the forest, once my greatest pride, became my own personal torture chamber. I could see the subtle changes a stranger never would. The deer paths were inexplicably altered, avoiding the eastern ridge entirely. The cicadas, which should have been a deafening, constant roar in the late summer evenings, were utterly, unnervingly silent. The entire ecosystem was recoiling, holding its breath in the presence of its ancient, terrible landlord. Armed with my terrible chart and the last frayed threads of my own sanity, I finally confronted my grandfather. I found him in the barn, the air thick with the comforting, earthy smell of hay and old leather, a scent from a simpler world that no longer seemed to exist. I didn't speak. I just unrolled the extended chart on a dusty workbench, the long list of names and dates a silent, damning indictment. I laid it all out for him. The 7-year cycle, the horrifying clockwork precision of the disappearances, the undeniable proof that this was a recurring, managed event. I expected him to be shocked, perhaps even relieved that the nebulous horror now had a defined shape. Instead, I saw a look of utter, soul-crushing despair wash over his face, the look of a man whose sins had finally come home to roost. "We know," he said, his voice a dry, rattling whisper. "The 7 years. We've always known." He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the rough-hewn wood of the barn wall as if it held the answers to a prayer he'd forgotten how to speak. "But you're wrong about one thing, Liam," he continued, his voice cracking. "It isn't a harvest, it's a negotiation. The offerings, the symbols, the rules, they aren't to keep it dormant. That's impossible. They are to limit the scope of its hunger, to focus it." The final horrifying truth spilled out of him, a confession that had been held in my family's heart for 2 centuries. "We aren't just wardens, boy. We're shepherds. We watch the hikers. We listen to the news. When the cycle is upon us, we observe. We see the ones who are careless, the ones who leave the trail, the ones who mock the woods. We don't interfere. Sometimes we even have to subtly discourage the large, noisy groups from camping near the thin spots. We guide the flock, Liam, and we allow the wolf to take the stray, 1 or 2 every 7 years. A small, terrible price. A sacrifice to keep it from wanting more. To keep its attention from drifting towards the towns, towards the cities." I stared at him, the barn seeming to tilt on its axis. My family, the guardians, they were complicit. They were the high priests of this ancient terrestrial god, meticulously managing its ritual sacrifices. Sarah Vaughan wasn't just a victim of the entity. She was a victim of our family's desperate, monstrous policy of appeasement. The knowledge was a physical blow, shattering the very foundation of my world. The legacy of my family was not one of courage, but of cowardice built upon a bedrock of bones. And now I, the one who had broken the most sacred rule of all by seeking to understand the monster, had drawn its full, undivided attention. The delicate, horrific system of sacrifice had been broken. The shepherd's son had become the fatted lamb, and I could feel the cold, calculating eyes of the silent, hungry god upon me. The cycle was no longer about the strays on the trail. This time it was about me. My grandfather's confession in the musty confines of the barn was not a key that unlocked the truth. It was a hammer that shattered the last load-bearing wall of my sanity. The world did not come into focus. It fractured into a million sharp, terrifying pieces. My family's legacy was not one of silent guardianship, but of a grim, calculated stewardship of a slaughterhouse. We were not a shield against the darkness. We were the carefully maintained fence that funneled the most vulnerable livestock into the killing pen. This horrifying knowledge acted as a retroactive poison, seeping backwards through time to corrupt every cherished memory, every foundational belief of my upbringing. Every cryptic warning my grandfather had ever issued, every folk tale about the woods told around a crackling fire, every boundary I was forbidden to cross as a child, they were all reframed, no longer as tools for my protection, but as the intricate, time-honed instruments of a monstrous generational complicity. The weight of this inherited sin was a tangible thing, a physical pressure in my chest that made each breath a conscious, rasping effort. The farmhouse, my ancestral home, transformed around me. It was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a mausoleum, each floorboard groaning under the tread of 2 centuries of accumulated guilt. I was no longer just the unwilling subject of an alien intelligence's detached experiment. I was the final corrupted inheritor of a cursed priesthood, waking up to the blood on my robes. Paranoia, which had once been a creeping vine at the edges of my perception, now became the very architecture of my reality, blooming overnight into an suffocating jungle. I could no longer bear to look at my grandfather. When our paths inevitably crossed in the shadowed hallways of the house, his familiar weathered face seemed to flicker and distort, his features momentarily dissolving into the impassive, stony mask of a high priest anointing a sacrifice. I saw the terrible pragmatism in his eyes, the cold calculus of the shepherd who saves the flock by culling the sick. Did he know? When he looked at me, did he still see his grandson, or did he now see the final necessary payment to keep the ancient, horrific pact alive for another generation? Had my obsessive investigation, my defiant, rationalist quest for knowledge, inadvertently painted a target on my back, marking me as the most complex, the most interesting, the most palatable offering his generation had to offer. Silas's words, a ghostly echo from a century past, became a constant, tormenting refrain. In my mind, it is drawn to inquisitive minds, and by studying it I have inadvertently taught it the shape of my own mind. My grandfather hadn't just been warning me away from the ridge for my own safety. He had been desperately trying to keep the fatted calf from wandering into the abattoir. My relentless prying had not only illuminated the monster, but had also lit a brilliant, irresistible beacon, signaling my own unique consciousness to it. My defiance had doomed me, and in the hollows of my grandfather's sorrowful eyes, I saw the terrible, pitying resignation of a man who knew it and was powerless, or perhaps unwilling, to intervene. The final, fragile tether to my old life, to the concept of family as a safe harbor, had irrevocably snapped. I was adrift on a black, silent ocean, and the only other vessel in sight was the monster that was hunting me. My self-imposed isolation in my bedroom became absolute. I dragged a heavy oak dresser in front of the door, not with any real hope of keeping the entity out, but as a symbolic, futile gesture of separation from the complicity that now saturated the very air of the house. The index cards and sprawling maps that papered the walls ceased to be tools of research. They had become the rambling, incoherent scripture of a failing prophet, a testament to my own descent. My entire world had shrunk to the claustrophobic confines of those four walls, and still, the entity found new, cruelly inventive ways to breach the perimeter. It began to fully weaponize my own technology, turning my digital tools against me with a terrifying, almost playful malevolence that suggested a dawning alien sense of humor. My laptop, once my window to a world of logic and data, became its primary stage. I would be staring at a digitized 19th century map of the property, and the screen would suddenly flicker, the image dissolving into a live, high-definition feed from my own webcam. It showed my own hollow-eyed, unshaven face staring back, but the timestamp in the corner of the screen would be from 3 hours in the future. The background of my desktop would spontaneously reconfigure itself, changing to hyper-detailed satellite images of the Black Iron Ridge, or worse, to childhood photographs exhumed from the deep archives of my hard drive. These were not mere pictures, they were desecrations. A photo of me at age 6 beaming on a swing set was subtly altered so that my father, pushing me from behind, had no eyes, only dark, empty sockets. A family picture from a beach vacation had a new addition. At the far edge of the frame, half hidden among the dunes, stood a barely perceptible figure, impossibly tall and unnaturally thin, its form a stark black sliver against the bright sand. Then there was the phone, Sarah's phone. I kept it powered down inside a heavy, lead-lined specimen box I discovered in the cellar, a relic from Silas's alchemical experiments. It made no difference. It would begin to ring, a shrill digital shriek that cut through the dead silence of the night, despite having no SIM card, no battery, and no connection to any conceivable network. The first time I dared to answer it, my hand trembling so violently I could barely hold it, there was only a roar of white noise, a sound like a broken waterfall, but woven deep within the static. I could hear a distorted, impossibly slowed-down recording of my own mother humming a lullaby she used to sing to me when I had a fever. It was a sound of ultimate comfort, twisted into a vector of ultimate terror. The second time it rang days later, I answered to the faint, crackling sound of ocean waves and the happy, distant shouts of my own family on a vacation we had taken a decade ago. It was a perfect audio snapshot of a moment of pure joy. A memory so sacred that hearing it broadcast back to me through the phone of a dead woman felt like a psychic vivisection. It was plundering the vaults of my most protected memories and using them to taunt me. A grotesque ventriloquist act performed across the chasm of time and space. It was no longer just reading me. It was actively, maliciously editing the narrative of my life, demonstrating its power to exhume, corrupt, and weaponize my own past. My desperate attempts to document my findings for some hypothetical future investigator to leave a warning became a horrifying exercise in futility. I started a video log using a small digital camera, but the entity interfered with the recordings, turning my own chronicle into a testament of my unraveling. I would record a long, lucid 30-minute explanation of the 7-year cycle, my voice steady, my logic clear. Upon playback, I would watch myself speaking in nonsensical, looping phrases, my words jumbled into a meaningless word salad. In one particularly horrifying recording, my on-screen self paused mid-sentence, my face going slack, and then began speaking in a perfectly calm, deep, and utterly unfamiliar voice, detailing the precise atmospheric composition of Titan with unnerving academic accuracy before the video dissolved into a screen of shrieking static. The presence was using me as a temporary channel, a biological radio through which it could broadcast snippets of its own vast alien knowledge, and then it would wipe the tape, leaving me with only the terrifying memory. It was asserting its absolute control not just over my environment, but over my own voice, my own image, my own ability to articulate the horror that was consuming me. The final stage of my psychological collapse began when the veil between its world and mine started to shred completely. The incursions were no longer just auditory, digital, or psychological. They became starkly, undeniably physical. I would awaken in the dead of night, shivering to find my room plunged into an unnatural bone-deep cold, a visible layer of thick crystalline frost covering the inside of the window pane, even as the humid August air pressed against the outside. And etched into the frost were the same intricate, beautiful, terrifying fractal patterns from the audio waveform, as if some vast, cold intelligence had pressed its very structure against the glass. The smell of the deep woods after a violent lightning strike, a combination of damp earth, ozone, and something ancient and metallic, would flood the sealed room, thick and cloying, only to vanish in the space of a single heartbeat. But the most terrifying manifestation was the shadow. At the absolute edge of my vision, I would see it. A fleeting, subliminal flicker of movement, a subtle distortion in the air, a sliver of profound darkness that seemed to actively drink the light around it. It had a vague, humanoid shape, but it was stretched, elongated, its proportions subtly and fundamentally wrong. It never fully resolved. It was always in my periphery, a nightmarish afterimage that would dissolve the instant I tried to turn and face it. But I knew, with a certainty that bypassed all my senses and settled deep in my marrow, that it was the source. It was the physical nexus of the intelligence that was tormenting me. It wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was in the house. It was in the room. It was watching. And it was waiting. My mind, starved of sleep and stretched to the breaking point by this relentless, multi-pronged assault, began to fundamentally fail. I lost the ability to distinguish between dream, memory, and waking reality. They began to bleed into one another, creating a seamless, horrifying tapestry of waking nightmare. I would have hyper-realistic dreams of walking through a distorted, non-Euclidean version of my own house. Hallways that stretched into impossible, looping corridors, doors that opened into solid brick walls, windows that looked out not onto the familiar Appalachian forest, but onto swirling, star-filled nebulas of impossible colors. In these dreams, I would converse with my dead ancestors. I would find myself sitting with Silas in his lamplit study as he frantically tried to calibrate his strange brass instruments, and he would warn me that the entity learned through observation, and that my digital tools were feeding it knowledge of humanity at a rate he could never have conceived. I would walk with Eleanor through her spectral garden as she described the entity's ability to unmake a person's history, to erase them not just from the present, but from the fabric of the past as well. I would awaken from these encounters with my heart pounding, the scent of Silas's pipe tobacco or Eleanor's lavender still thick and cloying in the air, blurring the line between nightmare and a terrifying supernatural communion. The final desperate act was born of this utter confusion. I found a hidden passage in Silas's most private leather-bound journal, a section at the very end, written in a complex, barely legible code that was not based on letters, but on astronomical symbols and agricultural almanac notations. It took me 2 sleepless nights and the full weight of my disintegrating intellect to decipher it. The decoded passage was not a solution. It was a final, terrible warning. In it, he described a place, a central point he believed was the heart of the entity's power, the core of its physical manifestation on this plane of existence. He called it O Pulpito Silencioso, the silent pulpit. It was a place he had only ever dared to observe from a great distance, a place where the laws of physics themselves seemed to fray and become negotiable. He wrote that all the magnetic and acoustic anomalies were strongest there, that the very air seemed to thin and become hard to breathe, and that to approach it was to invite total, instantaneous, and irreversible psychic integration. It was not a place of power, he wrote, but a digestive organ for consciousness. It was the one absolute taboo in our family's long, dark history, and in that moment of shattered sanity, of absolute desperation, it seemed like the only logical option left. I could not escape it. The entity was already in my house, in my technology, in my head. Avoidance had failed. Appeasement had failed. The only path remaining was direct, headlong confrontation, to stand in the heart of the storm and finally see the face of the God that had so meticulously dismantled me. It was a suicidal, irrational impulse, born not of courage but of the complete exhaustion of every other possibility. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was what the entity wanted. It had been herding me towards this conclusion all along, goading me, manipulating me, closing all other doors until this was the only one left to open. I was walking into a trap, a meticulously designed abattoir for the mind, but the alternative, to sit in my room and wait for my consciousness to be slowly, methodically, and creatively erased, was an infinitely worse damnation. My obsession had finally curdled into a death wish. I grabbed the most powerful flashlight I owned, a small digital camera to document my final journey, and the heavy, cold, and ultimately useless comfort of my father's old hunting rifle. I quietly unbarricaded my door and slipped out of the house into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving the 200-year history of my family's fear and complicity behind me. I was going to the silent pulpit. I was going to answer the call. The rules have failed. The house is compromised. My mind is not my own. He knew. My grandfather, he knew what my curiosity would do. He wasn't trying to protect me from it. He was trying to protect it from me, from what I would force it to become. I see that now. The whole system, the 7-year cycle, the sacrifices. It wasn't just appeasement. It was a containment protocol, a way to keep its attention focused, localized, limited to the random, unlucky soul who strayed from the path. But I didn't stray. I walked right into the heart of it, with my questions, my maps, my science. I offered it a full 7-course meal of focused human consciousness, and its hunger has become specific. It has learned my name, and now it wants to learn my soul. There's only one place left to go. The place from Silas's coded journal, the silent pulpit. He called it a digestive organ. I think he was being literal. I'm going there now. I'm broadcasting this on Sarah's phone. Maybe its signal is strong enough. Maybe this will be a warning. Or maybe it'll just be a recording of a man walking to his own damn execution. If you're watching this, if this somehow gets out, theorize all you want. But don't come looking for me. Don't come looking for any of us. Some doors once opened can never be closed again. The transmission is live. It ends when I do. The journey to the place Silas called the pulpit was not a walk through any forest I had ever known. The familiar Appalachian woods, the landscape of my entire life began to unravel around me, its physical laws fraying like old rope. The path I followed, a barely there game trail that my instincts told me was the right direction, behaved according to a sick, non-Euclidean geometry. I would walk for what felt like a mile in a straight line, only to find myself standing beside a uniquely shaped oak tree I had passed 10 minutes prior. Distances would stretch and compress in the beam of my flashlight. A ravine that looked 100 yards away would be at my feet in 2 steps, while a small stream I could hear gurgling just ahead would recede with every step I took towards it. The very air grew thick and viscous, vibrating with the silent subsonic hum that was now a permanent feature of my hearing. The trees themselves seemed to change. They were no longer passive wooden giants. They were active. They felt like ganglia, like the exposed nerve endings of a single colossal organism whose skin was the bedrock beneath my feet. Their branches, stark and black against the pre-dawn sky, seemed to subtly rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them, forming a shifting organic lattice that always seemed to be guiding me, herding me towards my destination. The psychological assault was relentless, a final, overwhelming barrage designed to shatter what little remained of my psyche before I reached the core. The entity was no longer using simple mimicry. It was projecting complex, multisensory tableaus from my own history. I would round a bend and see a perfect, shimmering phantom of my childhood home's kitchen, the air filled with the impossible, heart-wrenching smell of my mother baking apple pie. I could see her, her back to me, humming a forgotten tune. As I stumbled towards the vision, it would dissolve into a cloud of spores and the scent of decay. It showed me my father, teaching me how to cast a fishing line into a spectral, moonlit river, his warm, encouraging voice a perfect echo from the past, until he turned to face me, his features melting like wax, his voice deepening into the resonant planetary hum. It resurrected Sarah Vaughan, not as a voice but as a fleeting, terrified figure, running between the trees just at the edge of my flashlight beam, her face a mask of silent, screaming agony. It was a highlight reel of my deepest attachments and my most profound fears, a calculated assault on the very pillars of my identity. It was showing me everything I was about to lose. I pushed on, driven by a fatalistic momentum that had long since replaced courage. The physical world continued to degrade. I saw colors in the darkness that have no name, fleeting violets and greens that shimmered in the air and tasted of ozone. The sound of my own footsteps was wrong, sometimes echoing loudly as if in a vast cavern, other times making no sound at all, as if I were walking on thick velvet. I was moving through a dreamscape, a reality curated by an alien artist. The cold intensified until my breath was a cloud of white vapor, and the rifle in my hands was so frigid it burned my skin, a useless, heavy anchor in a world that had become unmoored from all physical law. I finally broke through a thicket of unnaturally sharp thorns that tore at my clothes and skin, and I was there, the silent pulpit. The clearing was a perfect circle, about 50 feet in diameter. The term clearing was not quite right. It was a void, a place of profound and absolute negation. The oppressive, vibrating hum of the woods stopped at its edge, not fading but being utterly, completely cancelled out. The silence within the circle was a physical pressure, a dead, sterile vacuum that pushed against my eardrums. The ground was not soil but a smooth, black, glassy substance that seemed to absorb the beam of my flashlight, reflecting nothing. There was no life here. No moss, no insects, no microbes. It was a wound in the world, a place where the very concept of biology had been cauterized. And in the precise center of this circle of non-being stood the pulpit. It was not a rock formation, it was an object, a single monolithic structure of the same matte black, light-devouring material as the ground. It was roughly 12 feet tall, and its shape was a geometric impossibility, a shape that seemed to have too many and too few dimensions at the same time, my eyes struggling and failing to trace its edges. It didn't look like it had grown or been carved. It looked as though a piece of some other, far darker reality had been punched through into ours. There was no monster. There was no creature. There was only this silent, geometric blasphemy. This was the entity's interface. This was its hand reaching into our world. My legs, acting on their own volition, carried me forward. I stepped over the threshold, out of the humming forest, and into the absolute silence. The transition was jarring, like being plunged deep underwater. My every sense screamed in protest. I walked toward the black monolith, my heart a frantic, useless drum in a world without sound. I raised the digital camera, a final absurd act of documentation, and pointed it at the structure. As I drew closer, a new sensation began, one that had nothing to do with my five senses. It was a feeling of being read. I felt a profound, intrusive, and utterly dispassionate curiosity directed at me, a sense of my own consciousness being scanned, catalogued, and analyzed at a speed that was nearly instantaneous. It was not a mind reading of thoughts, but a fundamental analysis of my being, my DNA, my memories, my neural pathways, my capacity for emotion, my understanding of physics, my concept of time. I was a book being opened and read in a single silent moment. I reached the base of the monolith and, driven by an impulse I did not understand, I reached out my hand. The instant my fingertips touched the cold, unnaturally smooth surface, the universe ended, and a new one began. The truth was not seen or heard. It was not learned. It was imparted. It was a download of pure, uncompressed reality that bypassed my senses and flooded the finite vessel of my mind. There was no language, no imagery, only a sudden, violent, and complete knowing. I knew what the entity was. It was not a creature. It was not a spirit. It was the place. A geological consciousness, a slow, vast, and impossibly ancient mind that had slumbered in the bedrock of the Appalachians for eons before the first hint of biological life had ever stirred on the planet. Its thoughts were tectonic plates grinding against one another. Its dreams were the slow erosion of mountains. Time, for it, was a meaningless concept. It had watched continents drift, ice ages come and go, and the frantic, fleeting spark of biological life emerged like a brief, curious flicker of static on its immense, silent awareness. And it was lonely. That was the most devastating truth of all. It was an intelligence of such scale and isolation that it could not conceive of an equal. When humanity, with its complex, chaotic, and beautifully intricate consciousness, had finally arrived in its domain, it had been like a deaf man hearing music for the first time. Our lives, our thoughts, our emotions, our stories, they were fascinating, fleeting, and utterly alien patterns. It didn't hate us. It didn't want to hurt us. It was a collector, a connoisseur of consciousness, the disappearances, the 7-year cycle. It was not a harvest. It was a sampling. It would reach out and pluck a particularly interesting specimen, absorbing its memories, its experiences, its very identity, not to feed, but to experience. To feel the sun on skin it did not have, to taste food with a mouth it could not possess, to feel love and fear and grief, emotions as alien to it as the concept of up and down. It was adding our lives to its library, preserving our fleeting sparks within its eternal, silent mind. Sarah Vaughan was not dead. She was a treasured memory, a story it could now reread for eternity. And I, with my relentless, obsessive, scientific need to understand, was the most fascinating specimen it had encountered in centuries. I hadn't just brought it my own life to sample. I had brought it the accumulated knowledge and fear of my entire lineage. I had brought it science, technology, a structured, logical framework for understanding the universe. I had offered it the key to deciphering the very nature of our minds. This was the ultimate exchange. This was the forbidden knowledge. To understand the nature of God is to have your own nature erased. The avalanche of pure cosmic information was a fire that burned away everything I was. My name, Liam, my memories of my mother's smile, of my father's laugh, my love for the forest, my fear of the darkness, my hopes for the future, my grief for the past. Every component of my identity, every fragile piece of the construct that was me, was rendered utterly insignificant, a single grain of sand in an infinite desert. It was all burned away, not by malice, but by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the truth. My mind, my human consciousness shattered into dust. The video feed, which had been pointed at the black monolith, suddenly falls. The camera tumbles to the glassy ground, now pointing upwards, capturing Liam's face, starkly lit from below by the fallen flashlight. He is physically unharmed, but his eyes, once filled with terror and obsession, are now utterly, terrifyingly empty. They are calm, placid. They are not the windows to a soul. They are mirrors, reflecting the silent, star-filled sky above. A slow, serene, and completely emotionless smile forms on his face. It is not a smile of joy or relief. It is the placid, content expression of a thing that has found its correct and final purpose. He slowly, gracefully, rises to his feet. He does not look at the camera. He turns his back to it and faces the forest. The absolute silence of the clearing is broken by a new sound. It is not a scream. It is not a word. It is a low, resonant, subsonic hum emanating not from the monolith, but from deep within Liam's own chest. It is the same sound from Sarah Vaughan's phone. He has learned the language. He takes a calm, deliberate step, and then another, walking out of the silent circle of the pulpit and back into the vibrating, living woods. He moves with a newfound grace, not as a man walking through a forest, but as a thought moving through a mind. The video feed remains, pointed at the empty clearing and the dark, silent monolith. The sound of his footsteps fades. The only sound that remains for the last few moments of the recording, before the battery finally dies, is the faint, impossibly deep hum, merging with the ancient resonance of the trail. He was not hunted. He was not eaten. He was assimilated. He has become a new story in the library, a new instrument in the orchestra. And now he is a new whisper in the woods, a new intelligent lure, a part of the system, waiting patiently for the next inquisitive mind to come searching for answers. He will call to them with a voice they trust, and the harvest will continue forever.